In the front lobby to the right, the code for the men's is 2000. Do it for you within minutes. We're excited to have all these great panelists here this evening. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Go ahead and find your seat.
Are we starting, Katie? Oh, yeah? Oh, great. So I'm embarrassing myself. Is the sponsor for tonight's panel. Holding this evening are part of our effort to increase civic engagement. So thank you all for being here. Session, and to do so through the prism of the pending ballot initiatives. We're hoping that our panel will talk about I hope you'll look out for the ABU Education Fund signature. I know we host with the John and some federal election debates as well. So please keep your eyes out for this. I'd like Representative Brian King and Darren Monson from the Sutherland Institute. Moderator Ben Winslow. I don't know if people can see Ben back here. I'm sure all of you know Ben from as a Fox 13 reporter and otherwise as a multi-platform reporter. If you want to know what's happening in Utah, frankly, all you need to do is follow Ben's Twitter account. And television reporting. So thank you for being here with us. So again, thanks for taking some time to be here with us. Who is watching online. So, what a legislative bills going into law without signature, and then 30 other resolutions that were pushed through. And there's a number of things that when you open your ballot in November, you're going to have a lot to consider. Signature gathering is underway to get for the ballot initiatives to get on there. There's going to be constitutional amendments, there's going to be referendums, and you've been asked, I'm sure, to sign petitions.
I mean, we saw it on several issues. We saw bills in the 2017 session that didn't pass, And much to the chagrin of large groups of constituents who finally thought, we brought this issue repeatedly to the legislature, we're continuing to not have any success with these bills, and so we're going to take it to the people. And in fact, at the beginning of the 2017 session, several groups, I think the folks pushing the marijuana, or we're pushing this in an initiative, and the bills didn't pass, and so so on they went, and I think that did inform the legislation we saw on marijuana this year. It also informed, obviously, with the Our Schools Now petition, which is probably the one that was closest to getting the required signatures. They were in the best position, I think, or one of the best positions. And then, of course, we saw the compromise legislation the last couple of days of the session on that. But without the pressure of those initiatives looming in the minds of all the legislators, I don't think we would have seen the same bills passed.
Derek, I wanted to ask you. You're an observer up there. You're lobbying up there. Your group is there. Did the ballot initiatives influence the legislature?
Oh yeah, of course. If nothing else, whether any particular legislator voted for or against a bill due to the initiatives, I don't know. We have a couple here. Maybe they can say for themselves. But certainly it impacted the background, the environment, the context in which a lot of bills were debated. Both bills that directly addressed issues that the ballot initiatives touched on, such as marijuana and education funding, but also other issues I think that then kind of had splashover impacts, and it just kind of helped, I think, maybe set some of the tone for what the debate was and what the discussion was and what the outcomes were.
Yeah, I think that's true in the sense of the legislature is very jealous about guarding its turf, and they don't like initiatives. I'm not speaking for myself. I actually think every one of these 5 initiatives has merit, and I support them, some more strongly than others. But from a legislative perspective, they're anathema, because it's basically usurpers, the people of the state of Utah usurping the legislator's role. And I think a lot of people up there at the legislature take that pretty personally, and take that fairly as a significant threat, and they act to basically co-opt that process by trying to pass legislation that makes it more clear in the minds of people of the state of Utah. The hope of the legislators is that they'll make it more clear by passing legislation. Number one, the legislature demonstrates to the people of the state of Utah, look, we can be responsive. And number two, that what we pass makes the need for the initiative less clear and less clear and present, and urgent is the word I'm looking for. Thank you. But it's interesting to also have legislators, and I've heard one of our dear Republican leaders in the House, before audiences, when asked that very question, Ben, say, "No, we don't think so." I mean, on education funding, for example, I listened to one of them say, well, you got to look at what we've been doing the last 2 or 3 years on education funding. We've made significant progress, and the governor's gotten behind significant increases in education funding, all of which is true. But it does not come close to what Our Schools Now is talking about, nor does it is it nearly as much as the legislature, the compromise that the legislature and the Our Schools Now folks agreed to put on the ballot in the form of basically a survey, a poll of Utah citizens as to whether they're willing to see their fuel tax raised by 10 cents a gallon. So it's something that I think is undeniably true, that it had a huge impact, but legislators are reluctant to acknowledge that, because acknowledging it means you increase the likelihood that in the future there'll be more of them, and we can't have that.
Well, that brings me to my next question, and this is for both of you, although you answered it somewhat, Representative King. For the lawmakers, how anxious do the ballot initiatives, for whatever subject it is, make your respective caucuses? Do they make them anxious? Are they cool with them? What?
Well, I can speak just as the leader of the House Democrats, and that is I think, I can't speak for everyone individually, but I think most of the members of the caucus supported most of the initiatives, if not all of them. And in that sense, we look at the initiatives and we say, we're moving public policy in Utah in the right direction. Yay for that. I think that that sentiment is not generally shared among folks on the other side of the aisle. Because generally, not always, and I don't speak for everyone, of course, but generally speaking, I think there is some, at the very least, hesitation, if not outright opposition to each one of those initiatives by Republicans. And so that's kind of where we're going.
But Representative Edwards, you're in the majority caucus.
Yeah, I was, and am. But
You are until January
I am
next year,
until
right?
December 31.
She wakes up some mornings and thinks, oh, I'm a member of the majority.
I think there are two issues here. One is the policy behind the initiatives, and the second is the fact that they exist. And so you have to kind of look at those separately and say, okay, the 5 initiatives, Medicaid expansion one, for instance. I saw your bag when you came in. Healthcare is a right. Is that a human right?
Civil rights.
Civil right, thanks. Anyway, so there we go. And so just the concept of Medicaid expansion, that probably doesn't have support in the Republican caucus. You know, if we just took a poll within our caucus. And then in addition, the initiative. That is, I mean, Brian said it really well, that the idea of citizens usurping the power, everyone has in their mind that this will be some massive slippery slope, and pretty soon will be like Colorado or California that has 30 some odd initiatives on the ballot, and that's just
Only
looming.
30?
Yeah, that's looming in our future, and what will happen. Well, I don't, my knowledge on this doesn't go back that many years, but this is my 10th session, and I know just a couple of years before I came in 2009 was the referendum reversing on vouchers, and that's the only time since I've really been aware of these issues in depth like this that we've had either a referendum or an initiative actually make it to the ballot and had a vote. So in that case, though, we actually saw that the voters were distinctly opposed to the will of the legislature and reversed that. And I think that, even though that was, anyone know exactly the year, was it 2006, 7? 2007? That's still, in people's minds, very, very large. Yeah, in the minds of legislators. And then we're also coming off the heels of the SB 54 compromise with Count My Vote. And that has turned into such a dumpster fire that is, I mean, at least on the Republican side, I can't speak for my colleagues, but that has turned into such a challenging situation that I think there are just concerns with initiatives in general, and what about these compromises, and do they move us forward in the right direction? But the idea of the policy versus the initiative, those have to be considered.
I think one other thing that we heard from legislators about the initiative generally is about process. You know, that there are concerns that so the legislative process, by and large, is a very deliberative one for the most part, right? I mean, there are bills that pass with very little consideration and such things, but those tend to be the rare exceptions. Of course, they're in the news all the time, so they might not seem to be that. But it's a process that requires a lot of deliberation, committee hearings, and then floor votes, and typically it requires a lot of consensus building and compromise in order to get something passed when there's opposition. And you compare that to a ballot initiative process, you know, there's a requirement that there be public hearings, but there's no real requirement that anything be done based on those public hearings. You know, that they typically, I think, do lead to some changes, because people spending money on ballot initiatives are smart. They don't want to throw their money just at something that's going to lose. But I think it's certainly, in my view, a less deliberative process, a process that's less prone to, say, have real discussion and debate about something, because it's drawn up by some folks who then it's some, but not very much.
Chase, you look like you want to jump in on this as well.
Well, I mean, look at the end of the legislative session. You have bills that are introduced on the second to last day of the session, and it's pushed through the House and the Senate without barely any deliberation. And yet that's allowed to be law, and it's good law. And to try and convince the people themselves what's wrong about it while it's gathering signatures. Once it makes it on the ballot, they have another, 6 months to go through a public dialogue. And sure, it's not the 104 people up on the Hill, but I mean, it's the entire state of Utah, and they actually get to vote on it. If they approve what the language is, then that is law in their eyes.
Here's been one aspect of the initiative process that ties in, from my perspective, a little more closely to Derek's perspective than Chase's, is you have the language of those initiatives set a year before people vote on it, and they can't be changed. You have the public hearings on the front end of the process, and then the initiative backers can make changes to adjust for the input based on the public input. But once those changes are made, and you start circulating the initiatives to get signatures, you can't change it. And there's a lot that happens in that year period. And in that sense, I think initiatives are a bit of a blunt instrument compared to a more nuanced approach that can happen, and usually does happen up the legislature. I take Chase's point about SB 136, a very significant bill, the transportation bill, the bill involving UTA, that quite honestly the process was atrocious on the day before the 44th day. You know, we had that bill introduced. Representative Edwards and I were in the House, and 9:15 p.m., not a.m., p.m. on the 44th day, the second substitute, SB 136, is unveiled. Nobody knows what's in it. And Representative Gibson he not only moves that and substitutes it in, and that wasn't controversial in and of itself. Everyone was expecting a substitute bill. But what next happened that was controversial is he didn't circle it. He started to talk about it and address the substance of it. And I walked over, it was a short walk, like 5 feet, to Representative Wilson, my colleague, my cohort, the majority leader, and said, "Hey, Brad, I thought we were going to circle this and talk about it tomorrow." He said, "No, we're going to hear it tonight." And I went, "Okay." And we had one speaker in opposition from our side of the aisle, and I think another person besides Representative Gibson from the Republicans spoke to it, no more than 3, 4, 5 minutes apiece. And then they called the question, we voted on it, it went over to the Senate, got concurred on in even less time, and literally within 35 minutes, that bill went from being unveiled for the first time, not just to the public, but to us as legislators, to being passed. So that's bad process from my perspective, but it's also, as Becky said, unusual. And we don't see that very often. The great majority of the time we see better process.
Well, I want to go over some of the ballot initiatives that are gathering signatures or trying to get on the November ballot. Some of them we're going to be doing a little bit of a post-mortem here because it appears that they're either not likely to make it or that they are they've struck a deal with the legislature. So let's just talk about them, and I'd like your thoughts on them. Representative Edwards, our schools now, it appeared headed for the ballot. It looked like the best that they could do, or is it the best that they could hope for?
For our schools now?
Yeah.
I'm convinced they had the signatures. They would have been on the ballot. And I was one of the that's the word, submitted to the Lieutenant Governor's office. But the other folks who during the legislative session had been more involved in those conversations with legislative leadership trying to come towards a compromise, their thought on that was that they always wanted to have some kind of legislative action, and they had been repeatedly pushing for this. And with the absence of any significant and meaningful legislative action, that led them to the initiative. And they said repeatedly, if we can work something out with the legislature, that's our first goal. And the the public hearings on Our Schools Now ended up, they did make some changes to the way the tax structure was going to be, you know, what type of tax they were going to be increasing with on the initiative. But I think it was a compromise that was really a big challenge, because they have 150,000 people who have signed for X. And now you got to go back to the 150,000 people who have really committed their heart and soul. I mean, in many cases, it's just a signature, but a lot of people, they're committed to that. And you have to say, we're going a different direction, and we're going to bring in less money, but this is better for this reason. And I think in the end, it is better. It's not bringing in as much money, but I think it makes more sense because it's better help for us trying to rebalance our tax situation. So I think that's a better compromise, and will lead us a better direction. The challenge with that is on Tuesday morning. I mean, talk about what Brian's mentioning with just this speeded process. On Tuesday morning, the leadership and in the House and maybe the Senate was involved. I don't know on that side as well, but Our Schools Now and House leadership had come to a place where they said, okay, we're ready for a bill. Well, that was on Tuesday morning, and that was day 43.
Your session ends Thursday.
Our session ends Thursday at midnight, regardless of the fact that Representative Red had a towel over the top. He was recreating the famous story of somebody back in the day. Literally, they hadn't passed the budget yet before midnight, and they placed a towel over the clock above the speaker's desk. This was clearly way back in the day before cell phones and all that, where people knew what time it was. Watches, I don't know how this happened, but when they finally finished, they took the towel away. It was 12:15. Anyway, so he was sort of playing a joke on that. But to get this done required some amount of utilizing the phrase that you learned your very first session, which is under suspension of the rules. And that's something you learn like week one, under suspension of the rules. And there are a lot of things under suspension of the rules. You can move stuff up, especially you see it the last week. Move things from the bottom of a calendar up to the top. Prioritize, move things quickly from the House over to the Senate. All of those things are not ideal. We have our set rules for one reason, is allows some deliberative process. But one rule that I was not willing as the sponsor, because I was the sponsor on these two bills, to forego was a public hearing. That was really important to me, that we have an opportunity for the public to have 24-hour notice, which is our normal rule, and to have a public hearing where people could come in and comment on it, or we could at least have a real committee make a decision. And so we were able to, they were still crafting that bill up until 4 o'clock on Tuesday. I mean, these attorneys can crank it out when they need to, and they were working their little tails off. So at 4 o'clock, the bill is ready, it's numbered, and at 4:15 the very next day, so with 24 hours and 15 minutes notice, we held our committee meeting on day 44, and then from 5 o'clock when the committee was over approximately, then it prioritized all of that. But I think in the end, this was a better situation than the Our Schools Now, not because it brings, the money piece is less, so that's a downside, but the fact that it moves us forward to a better balance of the taxation, I think, is a good thing.
To the rest of the panel, do you think it would have passed if it had made it on the ballot? I mean, it's one thing for everybody to say, I love education.
That's the issue, isn't it? And that's the reason that I think both the Our Schools Now backers and the legislature, leaders of the legislature, felt they needed to work really hard to try and come up with a compromise that would align those two, as opposed to making the public feel that the legislature and the backers of Our Schools Now weren't on the same page. You talk about high-stakes poker from a public policy perspective. Our Schools Now was it, still is it, but to a lesser degree than it was earlier. And the reason I say that is because, and I have been saying this for months, Our Schools Now backers are frustrated. I'm frustrated, and I feel their pain in the sense that people have been talking in the business community, in the political community, and certainly in the education community. Leaders across the state have been saying, literally for years, we have got to be doing more to fund public education in a way that allows people across not just the state but the country to recognize that Utah's moving in the right direction on this. And if we don't do that, it's going to hurt economic development. It's going to have downside, of course, for our kids. And every year that passes when we don't provide the resources that are necessary to really do a good job educating our kids. This is a kid that loses a year. And let me tell you something. If you have a kid that loses 4 years from K through 3rd or 4th grade, they've made irreversible losses that you can't do much with. So I really did think it was a high-stakes gamble. And the reason is because if you have our schools now hit the ballot and lose, the two of us as legislators, assuming that we're there for another 10 years, of course, Representative Edwards won't be, and I won't be either, quite honestly. But if talked about a hard push for vouchers at the legislature in the last 10 years. In the same way, it would be very difficult to get significant increased revenue for public education if our schools now was voted down. And so I think that was why pressure existed, certainly from the business community and the education community. They were very nervous. But I think that there was a lot of pressure, a lot of nervousness and concern on the part of leaders in the legislature, even from the Republican side of the aisle, to say, we don't want to have this thing go down in November, and have our hands tied. And so, to get to your question, would it have come up or gone? I think that it may have passed, but it's an awfully easy thing about raising fuel taxes by what?
10 cents a gallon.
Yeah. It sounded like it was a bigger tax increase to say 25%. This discussion about we were all trying to do.
Boundaries seem, which is independent redistricting, seems to be quietly out there gathering signatures. But when it makes it on the ballot at the end of the day, if it makes it on the ballot at the end of the day, is it actually going to accomplish anything when it is the legislature that makes the final decision about districts and boundaries? So is this just a feel-good initiative?
I wouldn't say that it's a feel-good initiative. I believe it's crafted to place like at the end of the day, it's the legislature who has to pass the maps. But if they're recommended a map based on certain criteria that they then have to accept or deny, and if they deny it, they have to give reasons for denying it. And then there's also on the back end, there's possibility of a private cause of action, people suing based on the legislature not doing what they're supposed to be doing when they draw the maps. I think it just creates levels of pressure that can hopefully take a little bit of the politics out of redistricting.
Derek, you have any thoughts on what you're seeing with better boundaries?
Yeah, I do kind of think that one wouldn't have as much teeth as maybe some others. Primarily because I think the case law, right? The judicial decision regarding redistricting are, I mean, they're not set in stone. They can always change, but they're pretty solid too. There's a lot of case history there. And as long as you have the one person, one vote kind of situation, you're on pretty decent ground. And so, would it have resulted in lawsuits? Possibly, but would those lawsuits have a good chance of overturning a map that wasn't, created for explicitly, kind of oppressive purposes in terms of people's voting rights? Yeah, I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong, because predicting judicial decisions is, it's like gambling basically. So, yeah, that one I don't know that it would be very strong if it gets there.
Could any of you see the U.S. Supreme Court in any of the gerrymandering cases is considering now upending all of this?
I think them just accepting cases. I mean, it's been, I think, 3 cases case law. You know,
and simply, well, that feels wrong. Go in and say, yeah, we just don't like that map, so we're going to overturn it as a political thing. When, you know, again, the case law is pretty clear. But if there was also, you know, a ruling from Justice Kennedy that if there was a good measurement of, say, partisan gerrymandering that clearly showed that it disenfranchised some voters, they would consider that. But they haven't been able to find that yet. And so if that comes, and if there's somebody brings that to the Supreme Court, I think you have a chance. If they're not, and it's just trying to say, you know, well, here's an example actually, where this may be the case, is in Maryland, right? The case that was just heard in the Supreme Court. You had elected officials saying openly that we created this district for the Democrat to win. Like, just openly. So, okay, yeah, if you but that's just not very many cases that do that. People are usually a little more savvy, I guess, or less power drunk, or whatever. And so that's, I think, where you're going to have a harder time. You may get something, but it'll probably be a narrow decision based on some outlandish statements.
It's a tough thing to come up with standards that are as clear for redistricting and anti-gerrymandering when you're talking about politics versus race or religion. I mean, those are more immutable things that you can measure more easily. Politics is much less objectively measurable. So I hope they come up with something that puts more teeth into that process. I think they probably will. Who knows what it's going to be, and I don't know the extent to which I don't think it's going to, whatever they come up with is going to completely upend anything. I was on the legislative redistricting committee back in 2011. That was a joint committee, the Senate and the House, and we went around the state and gathered a lot of input. There are, under the Utah State Constitution, 4 different elections that are redistricted by the legislature every 10 years based on the U.S. Census. State School Board, State House, State Senate, and congressional districts. Now, I know how it went for those 4 things. The first 3, State School Board, State House, State Senate, we worked closely with our Republican colleagues, had a good working relationship, shared a lot of information. Those decisions were made openly in committees. There were conversations behind the scenes, of course, without any doubt, that people weren't aware of, but they were almost always with some degree of, a high degree of cooperation between R's and D's. Was there gerrymandering taking place in those 3? Districting for? Certainly. But this is not something that is black versus white. This is shades of gray in terms of gerrymandering. And the degree to which there was gerrymandering in the House and the Senate, the State House, State Senate, and the school board was really relatively low level compared to the congressional districts. I know what happened with the congressional districts, and that is I didn't know, and I wasn't involved in that process to a meaningful degree. The Republicans took information, went behind closed doors. That information that they had, that they based their decision on, was primarily fed to them from federal sources and out-of-state sources. And you came up with a map that the Democrats had no meaningful input into that was a really seriously gerrymandered map. And I do think it'll make a difference to have an independent commission make the recommendation, and the pressure will be on the legislature to thumbs up or thumbs down. And if they want to do thumbs down, you better have some good reasons. And I personally think it's a very much a worthwhile initiative that will make a difference. Full disclosure, and I'm on the advisory committee for Better Boundaries.
Representative Edwards, do you want to jump in on that one at all?
You know, I just think they're discussions that I was impressed with. I went to one of the, I happened to be in like southern Utah at the same time that one of these community meetings was. And I didn't sit on the redistricting committee, but I went to one of them. And I was really impressed with, first of all, the homework that the citizens did. People had drawn their own maps at their houses, and, you know, I mean, on the congressional piece especially, but even on the State House and State Senate, people were taking this seriously. And I had a constituent who drew like 10 different congressional maps. I mean, he's really cerebral.
That's somebody who's really invested.
He's a very, very cerebral man. He's an engineer, and he took this seriously, and he had sent in all of his ideas. But even at this really small town in southern Utah where they held this committee meeting, citizens had brought in their ideas. It was respectful. People were listened to, especially on the House and the Senate seats. I think they were taken into consideration, and not being inside of the congressional, I can't speak to that. But I was impressed with the efforts that went into play for bringing the public into the conversation, at least on the other two.
All right, I want to get through some of the other ballot initiatives here, so I'm going to ask a little more succinct on this. There's a lot of ballot initiatives that are going to be on there. Derek, let's talk about weed. It looks like it's going to be on the ballot in November. They appear to be poised to have all the signatures necessary to qualify. So what do you see this debate looking like as we get into campaign season, as we get into vote for it, against it? And do you think, is this a case of the legislature not doing enough and facing the wrath of an angry public?
Sorry, this is on marijuana?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was listening to my colleague here. No worries. Yeah, I think this one, I think it's likely to get on the ballot, you know. There's a chance, you know, there's some, the news story that just came out, right? There's some districts that they are struggling with, and with the standards that are pretty high to get on the ballot, there's a possibility, an outside chance perhaps, that they don't get there. But I'm assuming it's going to. And if it does, I think you're gonna have a real debate. Right now, I think up to this point, there has been a real debate up at the legislature. I don't know that there's been a real big public debate on the issue, and a lot of that's going to start coming out once, if and when they do get on the ballot. And so I look forward to it, frankly, because there's a lot of information I think that hasn't gotten out there. I'm not going to predict which way it's going to go. You know, the polls say what they say. I don't know what those polls are really based on, besides, you know, do you want to help people who are in pain? And yeah, of course, I think, you know, surprising that not 100% of people say, yeah, I want to help people in pain. So.
Say that the legislature, well, the public feels that the legislature hasn't moved fast enough on this issue for sure. I mean, there's how many states now? I think it's over 30 states who have passed some type of medical marijuana law, and you've had very, I don't know, tear-filled hearings up at the legislature for the past few years of people coming up and testifying why they want this, why they need this. Otherwise, they're leaving the state. They're going to places where they can actually have this treatment. Is going to be a real debate. Throughout the legislative session, you heard lawmakers talking about the problems there were with the ballot initiative. And even when the governor signed and yeah, it's going to be a big battle. And I don't know how the vote will come out, but I'm pretty sure it will be on the ballot.
One thing that's interesting, so the medical marijuana bills that were passed were all sponsored by Representative Daw. So I sit next to him on the floor, so I learned a lot about this issue just sitting next to him and, you know, sort of picking his brain about this. But it was also interesting that he passed the bill that changed the date of implementation of initiatives. And I actually
it didn't make it through.
It made it out of the House?
It died in the Senate.
It died in the Senate. Yeah.
Died in the Senate. Oh, well, see, I'm glad I came tonight. I learned something. The point of that bill, though, was that you know, a lot of us have heard from our colleagues, let's say in Colorado, where the recreational marijuana passed and then, you know, goes into effect, and the legislature is sort of like, what just happened? How do we, now this bill is law, and we have no other structure around it to actually accommodate those changes. And so that was the intent of his bill, was to try and allow not the legislature to pull back everything that just got passed in the initiative, but to make some changes. So that was at least his intent with that other bill.
My prediction about that bill is it's going to get on the ballot and it's going to pass easily. And here's why. I think people know, have a sense of how they feel about this already. And you see a lot of momentum behind it from other states across the country. Becky talked about Colorado, and she's absolutely right. I listened to the governor, Democratic governor of Colorado, immediately after it was passed, speak to a small group of people. We asked him about it, and he said, we were so against that. We went, why? And he said, because basically what Representative Edwards said, there's no infrastructure to deal with it. We don't know what in the world we're going to do if this thing passes. And of course, that was recreational. But my point, one of the things I would say is you can get lost out in the weeds on this issue so quickly. If you really want to talk about the details, like Derek's saying, yeah, in the weeds, I didn't think about it. Like, as Derek said, there was a discussion. What do I don't know. You know, it really is a very nuanced thing when you start talking about cannabinoid or how do you say it? Cannabinoid oil and all this stuff. I mean, the details of this is so nuanced that I think people just are going to say, if it gets on the ballot, they're going to say, how do I feel about this? What's my gut feeling? And most people, based on the polling, 70, 75, 80% say, for medicinal.
Timing is everything on these things. I think an initiative question in 2018, you're going to get a completely different outcome than you would have in 2017 or 2016. So all the folks who will have signed this and pushed this issue so much. I mean, Chase referred to the heartfelt committee hearings and press conferences and rallies on this issue. Yeah, they were just pull your heartstrings, and still a rally in 2016 did not move the legislature. Here we are in 2018, and I do think it passes, and I do think that the legislature would never have passed, really in a quiet way, even the bills we did pass on medical marijuana this year. That would have been huge news in 2017, and especially in 2016. Like, wow, what's happening in Utah?
All right, Minority Leader King, the governor, did just sign the Medicaid expansion bill, ensuring that about 70,000 of the poorest get coverage. Utah, at the same time, on the flip side, does not have a big bill at the end of the day, according to the governor and legislative leadership. Why isn't that enough? And do you even think that Utah Decides is going to make it on the ballot in November?
Yeah, that's a great question. I struggled with that Medicaid expansion bill, HB 472. Representative Spendlove ran that bill. I really wrung my hands in terms of what to do. It moves us in the right direction, but there are some aspects of it that I hate. And it's still not nearly as comprehensive as it could be and should be with full Medicaid expansion. It covers about 70,000 people. Full Medicaid expansion would cover roughly twice that. I don't think it's the wisest use of, it doesn't draw down federal dollars nearly to the degree that it should and could, which is a tremendously taxpayer wasteful thing. We're leaving hundreds of millions of dollars on the table, even with this expanded version of what we did last year, Representative Dunnigan's bill. So I struggled with that, and I ended up voting against it simply because I thought it didn't go far enough, and the limitations on it, the capitation of it, the limitations on the work requirements, things like that, I could have gone either way, but I ended up voting against it.
But to the rest of the panel, do taxpayers ultimately save with this bill versus what they would pay if a ballot initiative gets on?
Well, there's no question if a ballot initiative got on and you passed conventional Medicaid expansion as opposed to this variant of that, you're going to draw down literally hundreds of millions more each year. So from a taxpayer's perspective and wise use of taxpayer funds, it's a no-brainer. Pass that. However, what we did with 472 is significantly better. I mean, what we passed, 437, HB 437 in 2017, Representative Dunnigan's bill, covered between 7 and 10, maybe 11 or 12,000 of the neediest of the needy, right? Which is really needy folks. And was it a movement in the right direction? Yeah, kind of, sort of. The match rate was horrible, 70-30 as opposed to 90-10. If we can get here's another thing about 472, the thing that we just passed, Representative Spendlove's bill. You got to get the waiver from the federal government. And there's no guarantee that the federal government gives that waiver. They just denied Arkansas' request for a waiver with some very similar components. So, you know, just pass Medicaid expansion for crying out loud, will ya?
Derek, you have a contrary viewpoint.
Yeah, no, actually, I don't think the taxpayers are better off. And this was part of the debates, you know, of Medicaid expansion over the last several years. We just don't have that money. Well, you either have to raise taxes, which won't be good for taxpayers, or you have to start cutting budgets. Enforcement goes to pay for our roads, you know, goes to pay for the correction system, public safety, and goes to pay for higher education. So which one of those are you going to take money from? And, you know, so I think, and then if you get into the longer term, this is really where I think the taxpayers are at a loss, because Medicaid is unsustainable as it is from a federal standpoint. The numbers simply do not add up, especially when you look at it in the context of Medicare, Social Security, and other entitlements that are going to eat up more and more federal funding. So there's going to come a day when that has to get reconciled, and I think the likelihood is that it gets reconciled by cutting federal spending to various areas. And then again, so where are you going to get the money from as a state? Because now you're locked in. You know, as long as we don't expand Medicaid under the ACA, that you can have a trigger that will just back out of Medicaid expansion, I have a tendency to doubt that's going to be viable. And so, again, where are you going to get the money from taxpayers?
First off, immediately, I don't think that it would have the huge fiscal impacts that lawmakers tried to make out. With HB 472, they kept on talking about how it was free. It's not going to cost anything. The fiscal note is zero. But they had to reshuffle around. And then fiscal analysts with the legislature's fiscal analyst office, they said that a full implementation of Medicaid expansion would have been $83 million. And so they were able to find this $50 million all of a sudden magically to pay for this bill, and would have only had to go up another $33 million to bring down hundreds of millions of dollars in federal spending. Then also long term, you're taking then we're not just paying for emergency costs for these people when they show up in the emergency room anyways. Who are among the neediest in our state and save money to the state in the long run.
If, you know, your question earlier was the impact of an initiative on the legislation. The Medicaid expansion initiative pushed and created this legislation, Representative Spenlev's bill this session. I feel that there was a less direct connection there than there has been on like the Our Schools Now bill or the Medicaid, I mean the marijuana bill. I think those were clear, like a response to the initiatives. And I feel like it's less that way with the Medicaid expansion, because I know Representative Spenlev and a small group of Republicans and probably all the Democrats, it's fair to say, were working on and have been concerned about how we could do something on Medicaid for at least several years. And we would have been Representative Dunnigan versus Spenlev's bill last year, because I was a supporter of Medicaid expansion, also the Healthy Utah plan. We would have been ecstatic with that in 2017.
You couldn't have gotten 472 through at 17. There's no way.
No, but if a miracle occurred. And possibly, I just feel that the connection there isn't quite as strong.
All right, there's a couple. We're going to get to some questions from the audience here. let's talk about the Civil War. And is Count My Vote is back. Is the moral of the story don't do deals with the legislature?
Well, personally, I think the moral of the story is you have to find a real compromise that people can get behind, as opposed to a compromise that sticks it to one side or the other, and it's not really a compromise at all. That's why we have the Civil War, you know. And now you can go back to, you can say that about the state party too, you know, like SB 54, Count My Vote never would have happened. By not making that deal, but really, I think it's a lesson in politics of prudence. You know, you have to do what's prudent for what you're trying to protect, and sometimes that means giving up a little to protect what you care about more. And neither side is willing to do that. I think both sides are equally guilty. You know, and so you're going to have this keep going on until maybe an outside party like a court comes in and says, no, this is how it's going to be forevermore, or people learn the hard way. And then we actually get something that is workable for both sides.
But you've had a court weigh in now, the 10th Circuit did, upheld signature gathering, and you potentially have another ballot initiative that could change it all over again.
Okay, so for example, on the ballot initiative, right, they originally wanted to eliminate the caucus convention system entirely. And then they went and had public meetings and decided maybe that wasn't going to be a good idea because it's about sticking it to the other side. It turns out people want more access to the ballot, not less, whether you're talking about the caucus convention system or signatures going to a primary. I think that's the lesson there. So again, it comes back to you have to find a workable solution, and nobody has really gotten serious, I think, on either side since the deal with the party fell through. And so we are where we are.
And then on the flip side, we have Keep My Voice, which seeks to end signature gathering and preserve the caucus convention system as some in the Republican Party prefer. Is that even likely to make it on the ballot? We have yet to see signatures show up even with the Lieutenant Governor's office. And in the end, in 2019, do you think the legislature is going to be dealing with that, all of this again, still?
Well, those two things struck me. I mean, that counter, what is it, Keep My Voice?
Keep My Voice.
That struck me as a bit of a, gimmick is too strong a word, but it was a strategic,
You would say that.
it was a strategic device. I don't think that, there's, like you say, Ben, there's no indication that there has been a serious effort to gather signatures to get on the ballot as a counterweight to Count My Vote. I don't know is it just Count My Vote that they're talking about? Is that the reference? The Count My Vote, I don't know that gets on the ballot. It might, but that congressional districts in 27, as I recall, May 28th for the statewide races. Those are not insignificant numbers. I mean, this is something that, from my perspective as a candidate in a House seat, I had to check that little box when I re-upped this time, and I thought, I'm not collecting signatures. I mean, it would cost, the cost for 1,000 signatures is probably around $5,000 to $10,000, depending on how you use it and whether you use volunteers or not. If you use volunteers, of course, it's a lot less. But if you want to pay to gather 1,000 signatures, $5,000 to $10,000, not insignificant at all. So but the numbers that would go down if Count My Vote passes, I mean, it's like 50 or 100 signatures for a House seat or something like that. I mean, it's dramatically lower. My thought on SB 54, this whole thing, and this is something people don't know and don't think about, and I try and raise it when I get a chance. For years now, we had SB 54 in 2014, and it's been under attack. Well, initially it passed by the slimmest of margins, and it's been under attack by people who hate it every year. And the only reason, both in 2014 and in each successive year since then, that we have SB 54 at all, this alternative route in the form of gathering about whether the Democrats, super minority that they are, in both the state House and the state Senate, make a difference, are relevant. SB 54 is Exhibit A for the idea that absolutely they're relevant.
Representative Edwards, any thoughts on this?
I just think it's a great example of how to not do something right. And I mean, from the process of how we got to SB 54, again, it was fast, it was rolled out, the compromise was rolled out on a Sunday afternoon in the presentation room at the Capitol, and it was also at the end of the session, and then the implementation of it has been such, we have such warring factions that I really would love to see those conversations have occurred at the beginning of all of this, rather than the year after, and here we are 4 years later, still debating these very same issues. And I don't think Keep My Voice has the signatures. I mean, I'm from Davis County, and at our caucus meetings, they had, those were the only initiatives that were allowed in the caucus meetings, was Keep My Voice. And so a lot of people thought that was just part of attending caucus, just sign away. But so that's just one county though, and maybe other counties did that as well, but I don't think they have the spread across the state that's required. So I don't think either one of those passed. Quite honestly, I think everyone in this state has had it with this whole issue, and I don't think either one of those passed.
Chase, you want to make a prediction?
I don't think Keep My Voice is going to make the ballot. I don't think they have the signatures. I don't know about Count My Vote, and I don't know if it would pass or not. I don't think we're going to see this go away either way. There are legislators who are inside party members who hate this compromise and raise multiple bills every single session to get rid of it. And so I think even having a court decision like the 10th Circuit saying that it's constitutional, well, they can just go change the law to something else, and I don't think it's going to go away. We'll see what we get next session as well.
One thing that we did touch on just earlier was the idea of implementation of any ballot initiative that potentially passes. And there was some bills that gave people who were supporters of these ballot initiatives a lot of heartburn. Ultimately, like Representative Dawes' bill did not pass. But you still had, and Representative Schultz had a tax bill dealing with our schools now that would have cut the taxes to the same rate as the expansion. Will we be seeing the legislature looking to deal with implementation? Some of these things set some serious policy. Will we be seeing that? And do you predict even in 2019 we will see the legislature make tweaks to how you even get a ballot initiative forward?
I can't imagine that we make that process any more difficult. It's already a really high ceiling for trying to get the signatures, and I think we've gone about as far as we can or should for the process of getting an initiative on the ballot. As far as what will happen in the 2019 session, I think you can see two kinds of bills. You mentioned the Schultz bill, which basically invalidates, if an initiative passed, if that were to pass, then it invalidates the whole thing preemptively. And that's one approach. And then the second approach would have been the Brad Daw bill, which just delays the implementation to the same date that regular bills that we passed during the session would come out. And I strongly do not support the Schultz type of bill that automatically preempts and negates the entire initiative passage. I yes on the Brad Daw bill because I thought, okay, this is based a lot on the kind of conversations that we were having with colleagues in Colorado, for instance, and other states where an initiative passes and not with the intent it to be implemented in a smooth way. So I see both of those potentially coming back, but the negating type of bill, I don't think, even on the Republican side, I just didn't see that there was a lot of appetite for that. It felt bad.
Derek, what did you observe?
Yeah, just quickly, I think you will see some things more along the lines of the Brad Daw approach. If for no other reason, then we got to all remember that whatever happens with ballot initiatives, if things go wrong, who are we blaming? We're blaming our legislators, right? So they're going to be held accountable for these laws regardless, because they're the ones who have the power to change them. And so I think they're going to be aware of that and do what they can to ensure that if there are things that were written into law that were poorly thought through or whatever, and that comes out, say, during a campaign, there will be a time period for them to go in and deal with that particular issue or this particular issue, because obviously I don't think they're going to go and repeal a ballot initiative that gets passed for the same reason we haven't gone back to vouchers and all of that. But yeah, I think there will be some examination, I guess, of implementation issues and how we can make sure that we're not passing laws that are going to harm people.
Right now, if an initiative passes, it becomes law 5 days, is it? 5 days after the vote. I mean, it's before the final canvass, for crying out loud, it becomes law. There are some good arguments as to why you should give a greater latitude to the legislature to make necessary adjustments to that. I voted against the Daw bill, however, for this reason. If you have something passed in the form of an initiative that really creates problems, you can always have the governor call a special session and have the legislature come in later in November or in December, sometime before the next legislative session, maybe early January, and deal with it if you need to. The thing that troubled me about the idea of delaying the implementation date to be beyond the next legislative session is I think it was a little too aggressive in basically neutering the initiative process by way of saying, citizens of the state of Utah, you say what you want to say in November. We'll be the final word before, May of the next year, and we'll deal with it however we want to in the session. I think it would make the likelihood that the legislature would either ignore or substantially what citizens had said in an initiative of previous November much more likely. And I didn't like that idea. I thought it was very hard to sell that as a yes vote on that in talking to our constituents as a way other than basically in one more fashion.
King on his what he said about these implementation bills were delay, especially because of how the bill was first introduced. It would have immediately, within the 5-day period that was already existing, allowed a bill to go through if it decreased taxes. But if it increased taxes, it would make it wait for over 13 months. And so you can see, even just the way it's introduced, that this is a way to preserve the policy.
But it didn't pass ultimately. So
No, it
do you
didn't.
see it coming back in 2019?
For sure. And I think that's just because we have so many ballot initiatives this year that they're going to want to do something about it, whether it's making it harder, whether it's delaying people.
Let's ask members of our audience if you have questions. Let's see. Do you want me to just take the microphone down here a little bit, or do we have a microphone out there?
Speak loud.
Speak loud, and for the people who are watching on the internet, I'll just try to recap the question.
Okay, I can speak loud.
Or just come over to Derek.
Okay, I can do that.
Do any of you all know the rate that, I'm under the impression that if an initiative gets on the ballot, it passes. Is there any, do you know if there's been ones that made the ballot?
I don't know.
So you're saying in Utah or just anywhere?
Just in Utah.
Just in Utah.
At least in recent knowledge, I am
There have been a
not
few
aware.
constitutional amendments, but they were not ballot initiatives.
Right.
So I'm not sure.
I don't have much experience.
That's good. That's good.
It's a brave new world, folks.
I would just like to amend part of what Mr. Monson said about the impact of the ballot Utah Decides Healthcare ballot initiative. It contains a provision with funding. I do not see how this would have negatively impacted healthcare. So although I realize the Sutherland Institute thinks any raising of taxes at all has a negative impact on taxpayers, I happen to think that not having health care and losing your house in a medical emergency has a much worse impact on health care.
Next question, or Derek, did you want to respond at all?
Oh, well, I guess I would just say that I think what you've seen in states that have expanded Medicaid fully under the ACA, there's a fair number of them that have severely underestimated how many people end up enrolling. And so the costs end up going much higher than the estimated, kind of what they've been basing the funding on. And then you're back to the same question, where are you going to get that money? Yeah, it has a funding mechanism in it. The question is how accurate are the guesses that we're making, which they're educated guesses, but they're just guesses.
I'm Janelle Vandenberg from Bountiful, and I have a great idea as how to avoid all of these ballot initiatives, and that's if the legislature will listen to the people. I'm such a frustrated citizen right now. It seems like these are not things that have been, suddenly creeping up on us. These are things that we have said over and over and over again, and the legislature is ignoring its citizens. And I don't know what the justification is. And so I'm asking the two representatives that we have here, if you could shed some light on the arrogance that the legislators are showing in completely ignoring what people are saying, to the point where we are willing to go to all of this effort. And if they change the ballot initiative and make it harder, then I hope there's a revolution, because it's ridiculous. And if they neuter them, if they pass some sort of law that neuters the substance that we're asking for, I mean, maybe I'm naive and I understand the deliberative process, but is this democracy or what?
I just want to point out, this is also one of my constituents. Janelle, that's a great question. What I would say is there are two options for the public. First of all, the ballot, and I mean the initiative process is one way to take matters into your own hands. There's another really easy way to deal with this. It's called the ballot. It's called
No, districts are gerrymandered.
Work with what you have, and
Then don't leave, Becky.
that's
When
another way.
you say that, she voted for Dawes' bill. Janelle, welcome to my world. In the first week at the end of every session, I go to the plastic surgeon, and I have plastic surgery on my forehead to deal with the scarring of banging my head against a brick wall. Okay? No, seriously. And you know what? I'm a trial lawyer. I mean, I love going to battle, but it is a battle every single year and every single session up there to deal with what I think is backward thinking on the part of way too many legislators in not doing what you just said, responding to the feelings of Utahns about how to move forward, whether it be education funding, or whether it be medical marijuana, or whether it be redistricting, or whether it be Medicaid expansion. I mean, all these, it's not a coincidence that you've got these issues that are gaining steam and they're gathering signatures on these initiatives. We've been talking about these issues for many, many years. And not just those. We've been talking about a lot of other issues too. So again, I think that Representative Edwards has it right when she says, get people involved and active in politics to the extent that they go out and vote, because it's hard for us to do much more, especially as Democrats, than we're doing when we're year after year after year, session after session after session, term after term after term, we are the super minority. What message does that send to the Representative Edwards of the world, or the Representative Speaker Greg Hughes of the world, or President Wayne Niederhauser's? It says to them, what you're doing up there as conservative Republicans is just A-okay with us here in Utah. And I don't blame them for acting that way and thinking that, because they keep getting voted in, not just as a majority status, but as a super majority status.
But how do they justify ignoring these ballots? I heard the phrase in here, circumventing the citizens?
Well, I'm with you on that. Talk to her.
So, first of all, they don't ignore the ballots. I think that's become clear. Whenever anything passes, the legislature will not touch it because they don't ignore the ballots. The question is how do we understand and measure the will of the people? Do you measure it by who gets elected? Because if it's who gets elected, then the legislature is doing exactly what we tell them to do. Is it based on just opinion polling? Is that the will of the people? So as long as we have enough opinion polls, then clearly they ought to do something. Well, opinion polls, that's probably not a great way to measure what we really ought to do, because they can be manipulated to say anything. So it does come back to these things like go organize people and go vote. And if you don't like where the legislature is going, vote for someone else. And is that tough? Yeah, it is. But it's the best that we have to deal with. And unless, well, no, I won't go to unless, because unless is worse than what we have now.
I'm just going to add one last thing to that also, is that responsive and even take small steps forward on some of these issues. Towards solutions, and that ought to really be our focus, rather than pitting legislature versus citizens and the initiative process. That should not be our focus. That shouldn't be how we see the initiative process. We ought to be able to look at that and say, this is fantastic that we have hundreds of thousands of people in the state who care enough to really engage in a serious way on these issues, and that ought to have been noticed by us, not just in 2018 when we could have 6 things on the ballot, 6 initiatives. That should have been obvious 6 years ago, 7 years ago, 2 years ago, when we had opportunities to take the beginning of some small measures that could move us forward, and next year another small measure, and be more responsive. It's not a giant step or no step. There are ways to be responsive in smaller ways.
I've got both of you. He goes first, and then we'll go to you. Okay.
You know, I have my own theory about why there's so many ballot initiatives this year. Well, let me go into just a little background. The last initiative that passed on the ballot was the vouchers. Immediately after that happened, the legislature made it much, much more difficult to get anything on the ballot. The next thing that happened was the count by vote in SB 54. Immediately after that compromise was reached, the people who, at least one side who made the compromise, quickly went on to do absolutely everything they could do to wiggle out of it and show that they weren't in favor of it. The legislature asked people for their ideas, went in and got strongly favored the donut approach. Somehow the Republican caucus went back in the back room and came out, and somehow the largest city and the largest county in Utah have no representation in Congress. What I would like to know is, why should the people of Utah trust the legislature?
Thank you.
Chase, you want to jump in on why should people trust the legislature?
It's the way we do democracy here. It's a representative democracy. We elect people to represent us, and I personally still have trust in that process. It's worked for states across the country. It's worked for our entire country for 200 years now. Whether or not or these other processes that we're currently having a heat about, but just because Democrats are a minority or Republicans are a majority and it's not getting the exact policy outcomes we're wanting, that's how we function as a democracy. And so while it might not happen as fast as we want it to happen, I still think that trust should be there.
Yeah, I just think that the nature and definition of a democratic government is what happens up there is a reflection of us. You know, this is the responsibility of living in a free society. And if you don't like what's going on up there, then you need to do something about it. And if you're not doing something about it, then it's a reflection of you, what's going on up there. Alternatively, if you are doing something about it and you just can't get it done, then maybe what's happening up there is actually a reflection of a broader issue bigger than ourselves. So, I mean, why we can trust the legislature, I think it comes back to, again, this is the nature of representative government, democratic society. They are a reflection of us. They aren't some completely independent entity that has nothing to do with everybody in society.
Let me jump with you with a question here, sir.
That's actually a perfect segue. Because I think to some extent that's incorrect, in that when it comes election time, the big guns come out, and abortion, and other issues, the church, and a few other big entities or issues weigh in, and that allows an election of representatives, legislators who wave that flag, but then really don't represent what a ballot initiative might cover. I mean, everybody that elected the group up there that's the supermajority might say, well, we all agree on abortion, and therefore we're going to elect all these Republicans. But they as part of the election, and so I think it's incorrect in that manner. When it comes to the convention system, I think on the Democratic side, the weak turnout that we saw at our neighborhood caucuses would just disappear if there wasn't a convention.
Does the House Minority Leader concur with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I sort of think that the reason that you see a lot more talk about SB 54 and the whole caucus convention versus primary system among the Republicans is primarily a function of the fact that there are many times more registered Republicans than there are registered Democrats. I do think that you have a tendency to want to, among a majority party, particularly conservatives, to sort of apply litmus tests and really, I mean, it happens on both sides. The extremists, particularly on all across the political spectrum among liberals and conservatives, are really fond of litmus tests when you get right down to it. But the number of conservatives and Republicans that you have in Utah means it's a much bigger civil war among them than it is among the Democrats. I would say this in connection with why should we trust the legislature? Any individual or group, entity that has ordained or given to it by whatever mechanism, a political mechanism, a religious mechanism, I don't care what the mechanism is, business, doesn't matter. They are going to jealously guard that power. They'll never give it up voluntarily. And they'll do everything they can to accentuate it. That's what you see when you see this incremental effort on the part of the legislature to make it more difficult for initiatives to pass. That's the most logical thing in the world in terms of human behavior from my perspective. I'm not justifying it, but it's human nature to accentuate and aggregate power that you are given and that you have. You're looking for ways to protect, preserve, and expand it. And we've seen that on other issues among the legislature in fights with the executive branch, for example. We saw that this session. We saw it last session. We've seen it in fights with the AG's office up there. The legislature is constantly looking to expand their power. You can agree or disagree with it, but it's a very human perspective. So in that sense, you shouldn't trust anything or anybody with power to do anything other than expand it. Now, there's another way in which you can say, why should we trust the legislature? And that is, should you trust the legislature to be a group of people that primarily, for the most part, are acting in good faith to find the best public policy and put it in place in Utah by their own lights? Subjective lights, but their own lights? I think the answer to that is yes. My experience, and Representative Edwards can tell you what she thinks too. Representative Edwards and I were elected the same year, 2008. We're both finishing our 5th term. Well, we will, at the end of the year, be finishing our 5th terms for each of us and our 10th year in the legislature. My experience, and I won't speak for Representative Edwards, my experience is the vast majority of men and women that I've worked with up there are really high-quality people who are trying to do the best job that they can to represent their people and to do it honestly and in a forthright way. We can disagree about whether, from an objective standard, they're accomplishing that as effectively as they could or should. I could tell you a story, a detailed story, that has to do with a key piece of legislation that I worked very closely with a key member of Republican House leadership on that in this last session that would provide insight into how nuanced the process is. But I don't even get, I don't see much specific horse trading going on. If you vote for this bill of mine that I care very much for, I'll vote for that bill of yours that you care very much for. What you see is much more nuanced, and it's much more the kind of thing that we all do with each other every day. You've worked hard to establish good relationships with people. You find common ground. This guy, I mean, Derek, I look at what Sutherland does, and most of it, honestly, seriously. But Derek and I have appeared at things and we've spoken. I know him personally well enough to say, I like Derek Monson. Good guy, smart guy. I trust that he is acting in good faith. I don't call into question his good faith. We disagree on a lot of stuff, but there are a lot of things that I have confidence that if it was just me and Derek in a room talking to each other, we'd find some common ground in some ways that advance public policy in the state of Utah in a way that I think not just him and me would say is a good thing, but I think most of the people in this room would say is a good thing too. And I feel that way about most of my colleagues up there at the legislature. Call me naive, call me Pollyannish.
What's stopping that from happening?
Yeah. I think it does happen most of the time, quite honestly.
I've been sitting in healthcare and it hasn't been happening.
There are some ways, I agree with you, June, there are some ways in which it has been frustratingly either slow or non-existent. And I think those initiatives are the high points of just that, where it's been either slow or non-existent. Medical marijuana, way too slow. Medicaid expansion, way too slow. Non-existent for both of them? No. There's been a little progress made up there on both those issues, not as much as we need. And that's what's promoted the initiative.
Katie, I think you have a question from one of our people online. You have 3 questions. We're going to have to lightning round this because time is getting short.
Of course. So a couple of questions from our online viewers. Why were there so many ballot initiatives started this year? What impact will Medicaid expansion bill have on the initiative if the initiative gets passed? So basically, I think this is saying, how does the Medicaid expansion bill and the initiative, how do they work together if it gets passed? And then the last one is, how will the legislature punish voters if initiatives get on the ballot and pass?
All right, I'm just going to throw it open to everybody here. It's a free-for-all. How is the legislature going to punish voters if the ballot initiatives get passed? Are you 2 representatives out to get people?
So I'll take the first question.
I mean, it's a fair question. It is.
Representative Edwards has been trying to get a word in for 3 questions.
Should we trust? And long before we answer the question of should we trust the legislature, I think the most how strong my answer of yes is to that. Brian and I came in the same year. Since that year, I have seen over and over to be more vibrant, more passionate, and as that happens, the stories of individuals, as was stated with the marijuana thing, those stories begin to expand people's understanding of an issue. We cannot have people understand an issue without, if that's not in their personal experience, they don't understand it. As stories from individuals come, and whether who have made a difference, reached out to their elected officials, that's where my trust is. That's where I think the crux of the thing that makes Utah great and will push us into being a continued great state and getting better and better by the year. And that's what really matters.
So I'll just take the first question about why so many ballot initiatives this year, and just from big data, right? It's they live and all of that. But what's made all of that, I think, practical, honestly, has been the SB 54 compromise. Because what you have now is an entire infrastructure out there to go gather signatures. And it costs a lot of money to do before, and it still costs a lot of money now. But now all you gotta do to get a ballot initiative is pay people enough money to go and get it done. And it's much more better understood how much money that costs to go get it done. Doesn't mean you can get a ballot initiative on any issue, but it has, I think, maybe lowered those barriers a little bit. So as long as you get somebody who funds your initiative, you have a good chance of gathering signatures you need to go get on the ballot. And that has all kind of happened due to the signature gathering path to the ballot for primaries.
Derek took the first question, so I'll take the second one. If the Medicaid expansion ballot initiative passes, it'll pretty much immediately go into law because they're not seeking a waiver for the Medicaid expansion. They're seeking to fully expand Medicaid. And so once it goes into law, the federal government will start matching the funds and we have Medicaid expansion. Pretty simple.
Sir, you have a question. You've been waiting.
There's been some comments made about funding. Where are we going to get the money? And I wanted to make the comment that where we get the money is a matter of priority. Somehow, when issues come up that the majority feels strongly about, like an Oakland port for the coal in this state, they came up with $56 million. And I don't know where they took that from, but all of a sudden it was there. Also, when something comes up where they know it's constitutionally going to be defeated, they still go down the same old road, spending millions of dollars legally, which is a total waste of money. So I don't really have a question. I have a comment. I just want to emphasize that it's priority. The federal government, you made a comment that there's not going to be enough money for Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security. Again, it's a matter of priorities. They're willing to go to war and spend billions and trillions of dollars. They're willing to put them in a situation where they have to take money from Medicare or Medicaid or decrease it because they're spending money on wars and other things that they prioritize.
Anybody want to weigh in on funding priorities?
I think that is just dead on. And it's hard to emphasize the point that you're making enough. Where we spend our money and how we spend our money is nothing more than a political choice. It's an exhibition of political will. It reveals the priorities of 104 legislators, and nothing more clearly reveals our priorities than what we choose to spend our money on. The budget process, my friend Senator Weiler, Todd Weiler, he is a good friend of mine. Even though he is on the other side of the aisle. He's the wrong political affiliation, but I forgive him that. Forgive him that short-sightedness. And Todd says, and I've given low panel discussions like this, and he says, hey, what we do, what the media helps, and this is a shot at you, Ben, you bastard. You and your ilk. Stuff we do. The budget. It's the budget. It's all about the budget. Stop distracting us with this idiotic, and it was idiotic, abortion bill about Down syndrome. Now that's a stupid bill in all my humble opinion. And yet, how much ink did that get compared to the details of the budget process? It's the budget that is where the rubber hits the road, ladies and gentlemen. And whether it's Medicaid expansion or public, you can go through every one of these, medical marijuana. But most of the big stuff we deal with in the form of these issues, I think the budget issues primarily. And I wish people would pay more attention to it. But it's wonky, and you close your eyes and fall asleep. But the math is hard sometimes. But I think you're absolutely dead on when you say, and it's true in my experience, and I'd be interested to hear whether Representative Edwards agrees. When we want to do something legislatively, we figure out a way to get the money to do it. Period. End of story. Think about Operation Rio Grande. That cost tens of millions of dollars. The Speaker, to his credit, in my opinion, last year said, we've got to do something about that. We've got to do something significant, dramatic, and immediate. And he was the tip of the spear on that charge. More power to him. It's got to be done right. I have some real concerns about that. But in terms of addressing that important issue,
the legislature sits on an appropriations committee as well. So Congress doesn't do that. Congress has one committee that does the bulk of the budget. So which committee are you on, Approps?
Yeah, executive, yeah, well, I'm on executive approach, but I'm on economic development. No, not, what is it? Executive offices and criminal justice.
Okay, and I sit on social services. So we're listening to you know, for the, I don't know, for the first several weeks, at least 3 or 4 weeks, we're listening to all the debates and presentations on the different aspects of things need to be funded within that category. And what I've seen over the past few years is that the guys like this and the leadership on both sides, Executive Appropriations Committee, they're being more respectful of the product that gets sent to them from the individual appropriations committees. Used to be, and this is always sort of suspect to me, when the committee sends into the executive appropriation, these were our priorities, this is our wish, and then it comes back, the final funding, and it's like, what did we just do? This doesn't even close. Respecting of what the individual committees do. So, to your point, it absolutely is about the money, and the impact that people can have on those appropriations committee is actually pretty significant. But the number of emails, the number of calls, the number of input, the amount of input that you get on an appropriations committee is so small. Even on social services, which is, I mean, it's huge, and we meet every single day. The other ones breeze through with every other day. And anyway, so that's a place where you could really, if you understand a particular issue, you could really make a big impact. It is hard to understand, but, and that's the other thing, you don't need to understand everything to make your voice heard and make an impact.
All right. I've been told that this is about the time I'm supposed to wrap up, at least for the live stream, but certainly people are around for one-on-one conversations. I wanted to thank you all for coming in. Thank you to our panel, all of you, for participating and sharing your perspectives on the legislative session and the ballot initiatives.
Thank you, Ben, for being our moderator.